He rubbed that cream on my back every night. He said it was to prepare me for what came next. And Lord help me, believed every single word that man whispered in my ear during those dark Arkansas nights when the humidity made my old bones ache something fierce. I'm Thessaly Brown, 179 years old. If you saw me at Hollow Ridge Baptist Church every Sunday morning, sitting in the third pew from the front with my worn leather Bible and my late husband's reading glasses perched on my nose, you'd think I was just another sweet old grandmother who bakes pound cake for the church socials. You'd think I was one of those harmless old ladies who talks too much about her garden tomatoes and keeps butterscotch candies in her purse for the grandchildren. But tonight, sitting here on my creaky front porch with nothing but the cycas and my conscience for company, I need to tell you the truth about what happened in my own house under my own roof. While my granddaughter Lily was off on all those business trips that seemed to come one right after another, I need to tell you about how a simple act of kindness turned into something that nearly broke what was left of my spirit, and how I discovered that sometimes the people who share your blood can cut you deeper than any stranger ever could. This story's been eating at me from the inside out, gnawing at my soul like termites in old wood. I've carried it alone for too long, and I reckon it's time to let it see the light of day. Maybe by telling it I can find some peace. Maybe by sharing what happened to me I can help somebody else who might be walking down that same dark path I found myself on. So settle in with me if you will. Me take you back to when my arthritis was acting up something terrible, and a young man's hand seemed like an answer prayer. Let me tell you how love and loneliness can make an old fool out of the wisest woman, and how trust can become the sharpest knife that cuts you. This is my story, and I'm finally ready to tell it all. You know, there's something about being 79 that makes every joint in your body feel like a rusty gate hinge. The doctors, they got all kinds of fancy names for what ails me. Arthritis. They say degenerative. Disc disease. Bone spurs pressing against nerves I didn't even know I had. But all I know is that some nights, especially when the Arkansas air gets thick and heavy like molasses, my back would seize up so tight I couldn't even turn over in bed without crying out. That's how it all started. Really, with pain. Isn't that always the way? The devil comes knocking when you're at your weakest. When you're so desperate for relief that you'd welcome help from just about anybody who offered it. My granddaughter Lily, she's always been ambitious. Got that from her mother's side, not mine. While I was content to tend my little vegetable garden and make preserves from the pear tree out back, Lily had her sights set on bigger things. She married Evan when she was 25, a good-looking boy with gentle hands and a smile that could charm the bark off a tree. They moved in with me after I took that fall in the bathroom 2 winters back. Said they wanted to take care of me in my golden years. Golden years. Sometimes I think whoever came up with that phrase never actually lived past 60. Lily's work started taking her away more and more. Marketing. Consulting, she called it. Big companies in Little Rock and Memphis needed her expertise. She said sometimes she'd be gone for a week at a time, leaving me and Evan to rattle around in this old house like two beans in a jar. He was always respectful, always kind, would help me with the groceries, fix things that needed fixing, never complained about having to look after an old woman while his wife was off conquering the business world. But it was on one of those muggy September nights when the pain in my lower back was so fierce I couldn't find a comfortable position, no matter how I arranged my pillows, that everything changed. I was in my bedroom trying not to whimper like a hurt animal when I heard his soft knock on my door. Miss Thessaly, he said, his voice gentle as summer rain. I heard you moving around in there, you having a rough night with your back. That medicinal cream the doctor had given me was sitting on my nightstand, but I couldn't reach around to apply it proper to wear. It hurt the worst. My old arms just don't bend that way anymore. When Evan offered to help to rub that cooling menthol salve into my aching muscles, it seemed like God himself had sent me an angel of mercy. I should have known better. I should have remembered that even angels can fall. But in that moment, desperate for relief and grateful for his kindness, I said yes. I let him into my room, let him sit on the edge of my bed while I turned away from him, modest as I could manage. His hands were warm and sure as they worked that cream into my shoulders, my lower back, finding every knot of pain and easing it away like he was born to do it. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the break. That should have been the end of it. One act of kindness between family. But Lord help me. It became the beginning of something I never saw coming. Something that would tear apart everything I thought I knew about love, about family, about trust. And it was right then, in that moment of blessed relief, that the trap was being set around me like a snare for a rabbit. And I walked right into it with my eyes wide shut and my heart full of gratitude. The next morning came soft and golden, the way September mornings do in Arkansas when the summer heat finally starts to break. I woke up feeling better than I had in months, my back loose and pain-free for the first time since I could remember. When I shuffled to the kitchen in my old terry cloth robe, Evan was already there making coffee, humming some tune under his breath while he moved around my kitchen like he belonged there. He looked up when I came in, and there was something different in his eyes, something warmer, more attentive, like he was really seeing me for the first time, not just looking through me, the way most young people do when they're around folks my age. He asked how I was feeling, and when I told him about sleeping through the night without waking up once from the pain, his whole face lit up with genuine pleasure. That's when I started to notice things about Evan that I'd never paid much attention to before. The way he had of really listening when I talked, not just waiting for his turn to speak like so many people do. How his hands were always gentle when he helped me with things, opening jars, reaching high shelves, steadying me when I got up too quick from sitting. He had working man's hands, calloused from his job at the lumberyard, but they were tender as a woman's when he touched me. The cream became our little routine. Every evening when the pain would start creeping back into my muscles, there he'd be with that little jar of menthol salve, asking if I needed help again. At first, he'd just work on my shoulders and the small of my back, keeping everything proper and respectful. But as the days turned into weeks, and Lily's business trips got longer and more frequent, those healing sessions started lasting longer too. He'd tell me about his day while he worked the cream into my skin. Stories about the characters who came into the lumberyard. About the old-timers who still remembered when my late husband, Walter, used to work there before his heart gave out. Evan had a way of talking that made even the most ordinary things sound interesting, like he was painting pictures with his words. His voice was low and soothing with just a hint of that mountain accent from up in the Ozarks where he grew up. I started looking forward to those evening sessions more than I cared to admit. Not just for the relief they brought to my aching body, but for the company, for the feeling that somebody cared whether I was hurting or not. In those quiet moments with just the two of us, with his warm hands working away the knots of pain, I felt less invisible than I had since Walter died. Lily would call. Sometimes during those sessions, her voice crackling through the phone from whatever hotel she was staying in that week. She'd ask how I was doing, how Evan was treating me, if we needed anything from town. I always told her everything was fine, that Evan was taking good care of me, and he was better care than I'd received from anyone in years. What I didn't tell her was how those gentle touches had started to wake something in me that I thought had died along with my husband. How I'd catch myself watching Evan move around the house during the day, admiring the way his shoulders filled out his work shirts, the easy grace he had despite his size. How I'd started taking extra care with my appearance in the evenings, brushing out my gray hair and putting on my better nightgown before our sessions. I told myself it was innocent, just an old woman grateful for kindness, nothing more. But deep down, in a place I didn't want to look too closely, I knew something was changing between us. Something that went beyond family obligation or simple Christian charity. It was during one of those sessions, maybe 3 weeks after it all started, that Evan's hands lingered just a little longer than necessary on my skin. His touch grew softer, more like a caress than a medical treatment. Neither of us said anything about it, but the air in that room got thick with possibility, heavy with things we couldn't say out loud. That night after he left my room, and I heard his footsteps patting down the hall to the guest room where he and Lily slept when she was home, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and wondering what was happening to me. At my age, I shouldn't have been feeling those kinds of stirrings. But there I was, a grandmother of 79, lying in the dark with my heart racing like a schoolgirl's. I had no idea that everything I thought I understood about those tender moments, about Evan's kindness, about my granddaughter's frequent absences, was about to crumble like old newspaper in a fire. The truth was lurking in the shadows of my own house, waiting to show me just how blind love can make a foolish old woman. There's a moment in every woman's life, I reckon, when she realizes she stepped across a line she can't uncross. For some, it happens when they're young and foolish. For me, it happened at 79 in my own bedroom on a Thursday night when the autumn rain was drumming against my windows like fingers, tapping out a warning I was too blind to hear. Lily had been gone for 5 days that time, off in Memphis working with some big corporation that needed her expertise in digital marketing or some such thing. I couldn't quite wrap my old mind around. The house felt different when she was away. Quieter but somehow more alive too, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Evan had been unusually attentive that whole week. He'd started bringing me little things, wild flowers from the field behind the house, my favorite peppermint tea from the store in town, a romance novel he thought I might like from the library. Sweet gestures that made my heart flutter in ways that should have embarrassed a woman my age, but instead just made me feel grateful to still be capable of feeling anything at all. The pain in my back had been particularly fierce that night, shooting down my legs like lightning every time I tried to move. When Evan appeared at my bedroom door with that familiar little jar of cream, I was near tears from hurting so bad. But this time when he asked if I needed help, there was something different in his voice, something deeper, more intimate. He sat on the edge of my bed like always, but when I turned away from him and pulled my nightgown down off my shoulders, his intake of breath was audible in the quiet room. His hands trembled just slightly as he warmed the cream between his palms, and when he finally touched my skin, it felt like electricity running through my old bones. That's when he started talking to me different. Not about his day at work, or the weather or the neighbors down the road. He started telling me how lonely he'd been, how Lily was always so focused on her career that she barely seemed to notice he was there anymore. How he'd married her, thinking they'd build a life together, but instead felt like he was living with a stranger who shared his last name, but not his bed. Not really. His hands worked lower on my back than they ever had before, following the curve of my spine down to places that hadn't been touched by another person in nearly 15 years, when I should have stopped him, should have told him we were crossing into dangerous territory. I found myself arching into his touch like a cat seeking warmth. He told me I was beautiful. Me at 79 with my gray hair and my wrinkled skin and my body that had borne children and buried a husband and weathered 7 decades of hard living. He said I had the softest skin he'd ever felt. That touching me made him feel calm in a way nothing else did. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper when he said these things, like they were secrets meant just for my ears. That night we didn't cross the final line, but we stood right up against it, breathing hard and staring at each other in the dim light of my bedside lamp, both of us knowing that something fundamental had shifted between us. When he finally left my room, I could still feel the ghost of his hands on my skin, could still hear the way his breathing had changed when he touched me. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay there listening to him, moving around in the guest room down the hall, wondering if he was lying awake too, thinking about what had almost happened between us. Part of me felt sick with guilt and shame, but another part, a part one didn't want to acknowledge, felt more alive than I had in years. The next morning we could barely look at each other over breakfast. But by evening, when the pain started up again, and he appeared at my door with that jar of cream, we both knew there was no going back to innocent shoulder rubs and casual conversation. We'd opened a door that couldn't be closed, started something that was bigger than both of our good intentions. I should have seen the signs then. Should have noticed how Lily's business trips always seemed to come at just the right times. How Evan always knew exactly when she'd be leaving and for how long. Should have wondered why a man who claimed to be lonely in his marriage was so willing to stay home and tend to an old woman instead of going out with friends or finding other ways to occupy his time. But I was too caught up in feeling wanted, in having someone see me as more than just a burden to be managed or a problem to be solved. For the first time since Walter died, I felt like a woman instead of just somebody's grandmother, somebody's responsibility. That was my first mistake. The second was believing that what was growing between us was real, was born out of genuine feeling instead of something much more calculated and cruel. The trap was tightening around me, and I was so hungry for affection that I mistook the snare for an embrace. The night it finally happened, Lily had been gone for days. 8 long days of Evan and me dancing around each other like two people afraid to name what was growing between us. The air in the house felt charged like before a thunderstorm, heavy with possibility and danger. It was a Saturday night, and the pain in my back was so severe I could barely stand upright. I'd been in bed since supper, curled up like an old dog, trying to find a comfortable position that didn't exist. When Evan knocked on my door that night, I was past caring about propriety or what was right or wrong. I just needed the relief his hands could bring. But when he sat down on my bed and began working that familiar cream into my shoulders, everything felt different. His touch lingered longer, his fingers tracing patterns on my skin that had nothing to do with easing pain and everything to do with something else entirely. When he leaned down and pressed his lips to the base of my neck, so gentle it was barely a whisper of contact, I didn't pull away. Lord help me. I turned to face him. What happened next wasn't violent or forceful or anything like those terrible stories you hear about. It was tender and slow and filled with a kind of desperate loneliness that seemed to pour out of both of us. He told me I was beautiful, that he'd been thinking about me during the day when he should have been thinking about work. He said touching me felt like coming home to something he'd been searching for without even knowing it. I believed every word. Why wouldn't I? When you're 79 and haven't been touched with affection by another human being in 15 years, when someone half your age looks at you like you're precious instead of pitiful, you want to believe it more than you want your next breath. We didn't go all the way that night. My old body couldn't have handled it. And maybe some part of me still had sense enough to hold back from crossing that final line. But we crossed enough lines to change everything between us. When he held me afterward, stroking my gray hair and whispering how sorry he was that I'd been alone for so long, I felt like I was drowning in gratitude and guilt in equal measure. The guilt should have been stronger, should have eaten me alive, knowing I was betraying my granddaughter, carrying on with her husband like some kind of shameless old fool. But the hunger for human connection, for feeling desired instead of just tolerated, was stronger than my conscience. I told myself we weren't really hurting anyone, that what Lily didn't know couldn't harm her. First night set a pattern that would continue for weeks. During the day, we'd be careful around each other, maintaining the proper distance between a grandmother-in-law and her granddaughter's husband. Come evening, when the pain would start up again, and I'd need help with that medicinal cream, we'd find our way back to each other. It became our secret ritual. He'd massage my back, and I'd let myself pretend that his gentle touches meant something real, something lasting. We'd talk in whispers about everything and nothing. His childhood in the mountains, my memories of Walter, dreams we'd both given up on long ago. Sometimes we'd just lie there in the quiet darkness, and I'd feel less alone than I had in years. The changes in me were impossible to hide. I started taking more care with my appearance, brushing my hair until it shined and wearing my prettier nightgowns. Caught myself humming while I did the dishes, smiling for no reason at all. When Lily would call during her trips, I'd find myself struggling to keep my voice normal, terrified she'd hear something in my tone that would give us away. But she never seemed to notice. If anything, she seemed pleased that Evan and I were getting along so well, that he was taking such good care of me in her absence. She'd thank him for being so patient with her difficult old grandmother, and he'd just smile and say it was his pleasure to help family. Family, the word started tasting like ashes in my mouth. 3 weeks into our secret affair, Evan started talking about the future, about how he'd always be there to take care of me, how I'd never have to worry about being alone again. He painted pictures with his words of growing old together, of him being the son I'd never had, the companion to see me through my final years. I should have questioned why a young man would want to tie himself to an old woman's failing health and fading years. Should have wondered what he was really getting out of our arrangement. But I was too intoxicated by feeling. Wanted to ask the hard questions that might have saved me from what was coming. Because while I was falling deeper into what I thought was love, while I was planning a future that included his gentle hands and whispered promises, the real plan was already in motion. The trap that had been set for me from the very beginning was about to spring closed, and I was going to discover just how blind a lonely old woman could be. All those nights I thought he was choosing me. He was really just following instructions from someone who knew exactly how to use my loneliness against me. It was on a Tuesday morning in late October when I first noticed something wasn't quite right. Lily had come home from one of her longer trips the night before, and I was in the kitchen making biscuits for breakfast when I heard her and Evan talking in low voices in their bedroom down the hall. Now, I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, mind you, but these old walls in my house are thin as paper and voices carry whether you want them to or not. I couldn't make out exactly what they were saying, but there was something about their tone that made me pause with my hands deep in the flour, listening despite myself. What struck me as strange was how businesslike they sounded. Not like a husband and wife catching up after time apart, but more like two people going over the details of some kind of plan. Evan's voice had that careful quality it got when he was explaining something important. And Lily kept asking questions that sounded more like instructions than conversation. When they came out for breakfast, both of them seemed different somehow. Lily was more affectionate with Evan than I'd seen her be in months, hanging on his arm and calling him honey this and darling that. But it felt forced, like she was putting on a performance for an audience. And Evan, he could barely look me in the eye, which was strange, considering how tender we'd been with each other just 2 nights before. I tried to tell myself it was just my guilty conscience making me see things that weren't there. After all, I was the one carrying on with another woman's husband. Maybe the awkwardness I was sensing was just my own shame reflecting back at me. But then Lily started asking me questions about my will. Oh, she was clever about it. Started by talking about how worried she'd been about my health while she was away, how Evan had told her about my bad nights with the back pain. She said it made her realize how precious and fragile life was, how important it was to make sure all our affairs were in order. She wanted to know if I'd updated my will recently, if I had all my papers organized where someone could find them if something happened to me. She mentioned how much easier it would be on everyone if I had everything properly documented. My bank accounts, the deed to the house, my insurance policies. Said she'd be happy to help me get it all sorted out, maybe even go with me to see a lawyer if I needed one. The way she talked about it made it sound like the most natural thing in the world. Just a granddaughter looking out for her elderly grandmother's best interest. Something about it made my stomach clench up like I'd eaten something spoiled. Maybe it was the timing of it all coming right after I'd started this secret thing with Evan. Maybe it was how she kept looking at him while she talked, like she was checking to make sure she was saying everything right. That afternoon, while Lily was unpacking from her trip, Evan found me in the garden pulling up the last of my tomato plants before the first frost could get them. He seemed nervous, fidgeting with his hands the way he did when something was weighing on his mind. He started talking about how much he cared about me, how our time together had meant more to him than I could possibly know. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said he hoped I knew he'd never do anything to hurt me, that everything he'd done had been because he genuinely cared about my well-being, had been past tense, like whatever was between us was already over, even though nothing had changed that I knew of. When I asked him what he meant, he got flustered and tried to backtrack, saying he was just worried about Lily finding out about us, about what it might do to the family if she discovered our secret. He made it sound like he was trying to protect me, but there was something in his eyes that didn't match his words, something that looked almost like pity. That night, Lily made a big show of going to bed early, saying she was exhausted from her trip. But I noticed she left her laptop open on the kitchen table, which wasn't like her at all. Lily was usually careful as a bank with her work things, never leaving them where anyone else might see them. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the guilt of what I'd been doing with Evan was making me suspicious of innocent things, But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important, that there were conversations happening around me that I wasn't invited to hear. The next morning, Evan barely spoke to me at breakfast when I mentioned that my back was aching, something fierce, and asked if he could help me with the cream that evening. He mumbled something about being busy, and maybe I should try one of those heating pads instead. It was the first time in weeks he'd turned down the chance to help me, and the rejection stung worse than I wanted to admit. I found myself replaying our conversation in the garden, trying to figure out what had changed between us. So suddenly, that evening when the pain got so bad I could barely walk straight, I swallowed my pride and knocked on the guest room door to ask for his help. But when he opened it, he looked at me like I was a stranger, asking for directions. He said Lily thought it might be better if I started managing my pain on my own. Depending on other people too much wasn't healthy for someone my age. He said it so gently, so kindly that it took a moment for the cruelty of it to sink in. I went back to my room and tried to reach the worst spots on my back with that cream, twisting my old arms into positions that made me cry out in pain. But it wasn't just my body that was hurting. Something had shifted in this house. Something I couldn't quite name but could feel in my bones, like a change in the weather. Lying there in the dark that night, unable to sleep from the pain and the confusion, I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing between Evan and me. If an old woman's loneliness had created a romance that never really existed, but I could still feel the ghost of his hands on my skin, could still hear his whispered words about how beautiful I was, how much I meant to him. Those things had been real. I was sure of it. What I didn't know was that they'd been real for all the wrong reasons, and I was about to discover just how much of a fool I'd been to believe in them. The next few days passed like walking through thick fog where you can see shapes moving around you but can't make out what they really are. Lily extended her time at home, saying she wanted to spend more quality time with family. But instead of feeling like a blessing, her presence started to feel like a weight, pressing down on the whole house. She'd taken to hovering around me more than usual, asking about my daily routine, my medications, my doctor's appointments. She wanted to know if I'd been keeping up with my bills, if I needed help managing my finances. When I told her I'd been handling my own money just fine for nearly 80 years, "Thank you very much," she gave me that patient smile people use on children and old folks who don't know better. The worst part was how she'd look at Evan when she thought I wasn't watching. Not with love or affection, but with something that looked almost like approval, like a teacher giving a student a good grade for completing an assignment. And he'd nod back at her in a way that made my skin crawl. Though I couldn't have said why at the time, my back pain got worse without Evan's help. But every time I hinted about needing assistance with the cream, one of them would find a reason why it wasn't possible. Lily would suggest I call the doctor about stronger pain medication. Evan would mention those heating pads again, or maybe one of those massage chairs they advertised on television. It was like they'd both forgotten that just a week ago he'd been in my room every night, his gentle hands working away my pain while he whispered sweet things in my ear, like our secret intimacy had never happened at all. I started having trouble sleeping, not just from the physical pain, but from annoying worry that something was terribly wrong. I'd lie awake listening to the sounds of the house settling around me, and sometimes I'd hear them talking in their room well past midnight. Low, urgent conversations that would stop abruptly if I got up to use the bathroom and they heard my footsteps in the hall. One afternoon, while Lily was out grocery shopping and Evan was at work, I decided to do something I'd Never done before in all my years, I went into their bedroom to look around. Not to snoop exactly, just to see if I could find some clue about what was making everyone act so strange. The room was neat as always. Lily's clothes hung up proper and Evan's work boots lined up by the closet door. But on the nightstand, on what I knew was Lily's side of the bed, there was a small notebook I'd never seen before. The kind with a little lock that teenage girls use for their diaries. I knew I shouldn't look. Knew it was wrong to go through another person's private things. But the feeling that I was missing something important, that there were secrets in my own house that concerned me directly, was stronger than my sense of proper behavior. The lock wasn't actually locked, just snapped shut. Loose. When I opened it, what I found made my hands start shaking so bad I almost dropped the book. It wasn't a diary. It was a list of dates and notes written in Lily's careful handwriting. Dates that corresponded exactly with her business trips, with notes beside each one about my behavior, my pain levels, my routine. Things like GT very responsive to attention and back pain. Worse during humid weather, good opportunity and building trust. Successfully. Took me a moment to realize she meant me. Grandma Thessaly. There were notes about my will, about my bank accounts, about the value of the house, notes about my daily habits, my medications, even observations about how I'd been more cheerful and cooperative lately, with a date that matched exactly when Evan had started helping me with the cream. At the very back of the notebook there was a phone number I didn't recognize, with the name M. Stevens, estate attorney, written beside it. I sat there on the edge of their bed, holding that notebook in my trembling hands, trying to make sense of what I was reading. It looked like Lily had been taking notes on me the way a scientist might observe a laboratory animal, recording my behaviors, my weaknesses, my responses to different situations. But why would she need to do that? I was her grandmother, not some stranger. She was studying for a research project. The sound of a car in the driveway made me quickly put the notebook back where I'd found it and hurry out of their room. By the time Lily came through the front door with her bags of groceries, I was sitting in my rocking chair pretending to read my Bible, though the words were swimming in front of my eyes like they were underwater. She seemed unusually cheerful as she put away the groceries, chattering about the people she'd seen in town, the weather forecast, plans for Halloween decorations, normal grandmother-granddaughter conversation that would have warmed my heart any other day. But now, knowing about that notebook, her cheerfulness felt false as fool's gold. Every smile seemed calculated. Every casual question about my day felt like an interrogation I didn't know I was taking. That evening when Evan came home from work, I watched the way he and Lily looked at each other across the dinner table. The way they seemed to communicate without words. Like they were following a script I hadn't been given a copy of. When I excused myself early, claiming I was tired, I caught them exchanging another one of those meaningful glances. Like my going to bed was exactly what they'd been hoping for. I lay in my room that night, staring at the ceiling and trying to piece together what I'd learned. The notebook suggested they'd been watching me, studying me, planning something that involved my will and my estate, but planning what exactly? And what did Evan's sudden kindness toward me have to do with it? Had those tender nights, those whispered words about my beauty, those gentle touches that made me feel alive again, had all of that been part of some kind of plan? The thought made me feel sick to my stomach, not just because it would mean I'd been played for a fool, but because it would mean the first genuine affection I'd felt in years was nothing but an act designed to manipulate me. I wanted to believe I was wrong, that I was letting my imagination run away with me. But deep in my bones, I could feel the truth starting to take shape like storm clouds on the horizon. Something was coming for me. And the two people I trusted most in the world were the ones bringing it. The morning after I found that notebook, I woke up with a decision burning in my chest like swallowed fire. I was going to confront them, not with accusations or anger, but with the simple direct questions that any grandmother had a right to ask her family. If there was an innocent explanation for what I'd seen, they'd give me one. If there wasn't, well, at least I'd know where I stood. But when I shuffled into the kitchen that morning, ready to face whatever truth was waiting for me, I found a note propped against the coffee pot in Lily's handwriting. She'd been called away on another emergency business trip. Something about a client in Dallas having a marketing crisis that required her immediate attention. She'd be gone for at least a week, maybe longer. Evan had already left for work, and the house felt emptier than it had in months. Empty and somehow menacing, like the calm before a tornado when all the birds stop singing and the air gets still as death. I spent that day in a state of nervous energy, jumping at every sound, checking and rechecking the locks on the doors. My mind kept circling back to those notes in Lily's book, trying to make sense of what building trust successfully could. What kind of plan would require studying an old woman's daily habits like she was some kind of specimen? When Evan came home that evening, he seemed different again. Not cold like he'd been the past few days, but almost apologetic, like he was carrying the weight of something he couldn't quite bring himself to say. He made dinner for both of us. Nothing fancy, just scrambled eggs and toast, but he kept glancing at me across the table like he was trying to memorize my face. After we ate, he asked if I wanted to sit on the porch for a while. It was one of those perfect October evenings, cool but not cold, with the last of the autumn leaves rustling in the trees around the house. We sat in the old rockers that Walter had built back when we were first married, and for a few minutes it almost felt normal again. That's when Evan started talking about the future. Not our future together like he had before, but my future specifically. He asked if I'd given any thought to what would happen to me as I got older if my health got worse. He wanted to know if I'd considered moving to one of those assisted living places or maybe hiring someone to come help me around the house. His concern sounded genuine, but there was something underneath it that made my skin prickle with unease. When I told him I planned to stay right here in this house until the good Lord called me home, he got quiet in a way that felt heavy with things he wasn't saying. Then he said something that made my blood turn to ice water. He said he hoped I knew that whatever happened, he'd always think of our time together as special. Past tense again, like he was already saying goodbye to something that hadn't ended yet. When I asked him what he meant by whatever happened, he looked away toward the tree and said, "Sometimes life took turns you didn't expect. Sometimes people had to make hard choices for reasons that might not make sense from the outside." Pressed him for details, but he just shook his head and said he probably shouldn't have brought it up. Said he was just feeling melancholy with Lily gone and the weather turning cold, but there was something in his voice that sounded more like guilt than melancholy. That night I couldn't sleep at all. Kept replaying our conversation, trying to read between the lines of what he'd said. The way he'd talked about hard choices and unexpected turns felt like a warning, like he was trying to prepare me for something without actually telling me what it was. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard him moving around in the kitchen. Soft footsteps, the sound of cabinet doors opening and closing, water running in the sink. I thought about getting up to see if he needed anything, but something told me to stay put, to listen instead. I heard him on the phone speaking in whispers so low I couldn't make out the words, but I could tell from his tone that he was talking to someone he knew well, someone he was comfortable with. The conversation went on for maybe 10 minutes, and when it ended I heard him moving around the house like he was checking things, doors, windows, maybe going through papers. The next morning, he was gone before I woke up. Left a note saying he'd been called in early to work on a special project. Wouldn't be home until late. But when I called the lumberyard around noon just to see how he was doing, they told me Evan wasn't scheduled to work that day at all. That's when the real fear set in. Not just confusion or hurt feelings, but genuine terror that I was in some kind of danger I didn't understand. If Evan was lying about where he was, if Lily's business trip was as convenient as it seemed, if that notebook full of observations about my behavior was part of some larger plan, then I was alone in this house with people who might not have my best interests at heart. I spent that afternoon going through my important papers, making sure I knew where everything was: my will, my bank account information, the deed to the house. All of it locked in the old filing cabinet in Walter's study, just like it had been for years. But now, knowing that someone had been taking notes about these very things, the familiar documents felt different somehow, less like security and more like targets. That evening Evan came home acting perfectly normal, asking about my day and apologizing for being gone so long. He said the special project at work had taken longer than expected, but he was home now and did I need anything. I wanted to ask him where he'd really been. Wanted to confront him about the phone call I'd heard in the middle of the night. But looking at his face, handsome and concerned and so convincingly innocent, I realized I was afraid of what he might say if I pushed too hard. Instead, I told him my back was hurting something fierce and asked if he could help me with the cream one more time. It was a test, I suppose. He said yes, maybe I was imagining all the sinister undertones. He said no, well, that would tell me something too. He hesitated for just a moment too long before agreeing, and when we went to my room, his touch felt different, still gentle, but distant somehow. Professional instead of intimate, like he was going through the motions of something he no longer wanted to do. His hands worked over my shoulders and back. I found myself wondering if this might be the last time. Not because I was planning to end it, but because I had the strangest feeling that everything was about to change in ways I couldn't control or predict. When he finished and moved toward the door, I called his name softly. He turned back, and for just a moment, I saw something in his eyes that looked like genuine sadness, like he was sorry for something that hadn't happened yet. That look haunted me all through the sleepless night that followed, because it was the expression of a man who knew exactly what was coming next, even if I didn't. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of October day that makes you think winter's coming, whether you're ready for it or not. I'd barely slept, my mind churning over everything I'd seen and heard in the past few days. That notebook, Evan's strange behavior, Lily's convenient absences, the lies about where he'd been. By the time I heard him moving around in the kitchen, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to sit around like some helpless old fool waiting for whatever was coming to hit me. I was going to do something I'd never done in all my 79 years. I was going to snoop properly, thoroughly, until I found out exactly what was going on in my own house. When Evan left for work or wherever he really went during the day, I started in their bedroom, going through everything more carefully than I had before. That notebook was still there, but now there were new entries, notes from the past few days, that made my stomach clench with recognition and dread. GT asking more questions, becoming suspicious, One entry. Read. Another said, Ease reports resistance increasing, may need to accelerate timeline. And at the bottom of the most recent page, attorney meeting scheduled for Friday. All documents ready. Ease had to be Evan Stevens. And the attorney meeting was in 2 days. I sat there on their bed, that notebook trembling in my hands, trying to absorb what I was reading. It wasn't just that they'd been planning something behind my back. They'd been planning it for months, maybe longer. Every kindness Evan had shown me, every tender moment we'd shared had been documented like evidence in a case file. But evidence of what exactly? Kept searching, going through Lily's dresser drawers, her closet, anywhere she might have hidden more information. In a shoe box on the top shelf of her closet, buried under old photographs, I found a folder marked inheritance documentation. In her careful handwriting, inside were photocopies of documents I recognized: my will, my bank statements, the deed to the house, but there were also papers I'd never seen before. Legal forms with my name on them. Documents that looked official, but that I was certain I'd never signed. One of them was a power of attorney form giving Lily complete control over my finances and medical decisions. My signature at the bottom looked real enough, but I had no memory of ever signing such a thing. Another document appeared to transfer ownership of the house to Lily in the event of incapacitation or death of the current owner. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the papers. These weren't just plans, they were forgeries. Someone had been practicing my signature, creating legal documents that would give them control over everything I owned. The sound of a car in the driveway sent me scrambling to put everything back where I'd found it. But instead of Evan's truck, it was a sedan I didn't recognize. Through the bedroom window, I watched a man in a dark suit get out, carrying a briefcase and looking at the house like he was checking an address. I made it to the front door just as he knocked. He introduced himself as Michael Stevens, an attorney from Little Rock, and said he was there for an appointment with Lily Emerson regarding some estate planning matters. When I told him Lily wasn't home, that she was out of town on business, his face registered surprise, and something that might have been annoyance. He checked his phone, mumbling about confirmed appointments and wasted trips. Then he looked at me more closely and asked if I was Mrs. Brown, the property owner. Something in his tone made me cautious. I admitted I was, but when he started asking questions about my will and whether I'd given any thought to updating my estate plan, alarm bells started going off in my head. This was the same attorney whose name had been in Lily's notebook. I told him I wasn't interested in changing my will, that everything was already arranged the way I wanted it. But he persisted, saying Lily had been very concerned about my welfare, that she'd explained how I'd been having memory issues and difficulty managing my affairs. Memory issues? That was news to me. My mind was as sharp as it had ever been, sharper maybe than it had been in years now that I understood what was happening around me. I told Mr. Stevens there must be some mistake, that I hadn't authorized any meetings about my estate. His expression shifted then, becoming more professional and distant. He said he'd need to reschedule with Lily directly. But before he left, he mentioned that time was often a factor in these situations, that it was usually best to get affairs in order before health issues made decisions more complicated. After he drove away, I sat in my kitchen trying to piece together what I'd learned. The forged documents, the attorney expecting to meet with Lily about my estate, Evan's behavior over the past months. It was all starting to form. A picture I didn't want to see clearly. They weren't just planning to take my money. They were planning to have me declared incompetent, to use those forged power of attorney documents to take control of everything I owned. Evan's job in all this had been to gain my trust, to make me dependent on him, to create a situation where I'd seem incapable of caring for myself. Every tender moment between us, every whispered word about how beautiful I was, every gentle touch that had made me feel alive again, it had all been calculated to make me vulnerable, to set me up for this betrayal. The worst part was that it had worked. Had become dependent on Evan's help. Had started looking forward to his attention more than anything else in my daily routine. Without meaning to, I'd played right into their hands. But now I knew, and knowing meant I had to make a choice about what to do with the truth. I could confront them when they returned, demand an explanation, threaten to call the police. But I was one old woman against two younger, cleverer people who'd been planning this for months. They'd probably have explanations ready, ways to make me doubt what I'd seen, reasons why I was confused or mistaken, or I could pretend I didn't know anything and try to figure out how to protect myself without them realizing I was on to their game. Neither choice felt safe. But as I sat there in my kitchen, surrounded by the familiar things of a life I'd built over nearly 8 decades, I realized that the scared, helpless old woman they thought they were manipulating wasn't who I really was. I was Thessaly Brown, and I'd survived the Depression, World War II, raising children, burying a husband, and 79 years of life's hardships. Wasn't about to let two smooth-talking con artists steal everything I'd worked for just because they thought I was too old and lonely to fight back. The question wasn't whether I was going to stop them. The question was how. Friday morning came too soon and not soon enough. I'd spent the past 2 days moving through my daily routine like an actress in a play, pretending everything was normal while my insides churned with the knowledge of what was planned for me. Evan had been unusually attentive, almost tender, like a man trying to ease his conscience before committing a terrible act. Lily had returned from her business trip the night before, full of stories about Dallas and client meetings that I now knew were lies. They thought they had me fooled completely. Maybe if I'd been the helpless old woman they believed me to be, they would have. But I'd spent those 2 days preparing for this moment in ways they couldn't have imagined. I'd called my real lawyer, Harold Morrison, who'd handled Walter's affairs and mine for the past 20 years. I'd explained the situation to him in careful detail, and he'd assured me that any documents I hadn't personally signed in his presence would be worthless in court. More importantly, he'd helped me set up a little insurance policy of my own. I'd also done something that would have seemed impossible to the frightened woman I'd been just a week ago. I'd installed a small recording device in my bedroom. Nothing fancy, just one of those digital recorders they sell at the electronics store, hidden behind the old jewelry box on my dresser. The attorney was scheduled to arrive at 2 o'clock. At 1:30, Lily knocked on my bedroom door with that sweet, concerned smile she'd perfected over the months of planning my downfall. She said, "Mr. Stevens was coming to help us organize my affairs to make sure everything was properly documented in case something happened to me." She spoke to me like I was a child who needed things explained simply, using that patient tone people reserve for the very old or very simple. Told me she'd been worried about me lately, that she'd noticed I'd been forgetting things, getting confused about dates and events. She said Evan had mentioned that I sometimes seemed disoriented when he helped me with my medications, that there had been nights when I'd called him by Walter's name or talked about people who'd been dead for years. Every word was a lie, but delivered with such convincing concern that I almost started to doubt my own memory. Almost. But I held on to the truth like a lifeline. I knew exactly who I was, what I'd seen, and what they were trying to do to me. When Mr. Stevens arrived, the three of us gathered in my living room like civilized people having a normal business meeting. He spread his papers across my coffee table, the same forged documents I'd found in Lily's closet, along with some new ones that looked even more official. He explained that Lily had been concerned about my welfare, that she'd observed troubling signs that I might not be capable of managing my own affairs much longer. He spoke about me like I wasn't even in the room, discussing my declining mental capacity and inability to care for myself properly, as if these were established facts instead of fabrications. The power of attorney documents sat on top of the pile, my forged signature clearly visible at the bottom. That's when I made my move. I picked up the document and examined it closely, as if I was trying to remember signing it. Then I looked up at all three of them and said in the most confused voice I could manage that I didn't recall putting my name on this particular paper, but that my memory wasn't what it used to be. The relief in their faces was unmistakable. They thought I was giving them permission to proceed, admitting to the mental confusion they'd been claiming I suffered from. Mr. Stevens pulled out another set of documents, papers that would transfer the house deed directly to Lily, allegedly to protect the property from potential nursing home. That's when Evan spoke up and his words cut through me like glass. He said he'd seen firsthand how much I'd been struggling lately. He described evenings when I'd been so disoriented that I'd asked him to help me with things that weren't appropriate, when my confusion had led me to misinterpret his kindness as something else entirely. He was rewriting our entire relationship, making me sound like a delusional old woman who'd imagined romantic feelings where none existed, making himself sound like the long-suffering caregiver who'd endured my inappropriate behavior out of family loyalty. But I caught something in his voice, a slight tremor when he talked about those evening sessions with the medicinal cream. Despite all his lies and manipulation, there was still something real underneath it all. Maybe guilt, maybe actual affection that had grown alongside the deception. That tiny crack in his performance gave me the courage to do what I did next. I stood up from my chair, walked to the coffee table where all their carefully prepared documents were spread out, and picked up a pen. For a moment they all held their breath, thinking I was about to sign away my life's work and my independence. Instead, I looked directly at Mr. Stevenson, said in the clearest, strongest voice I could summon, that I had never signed any power of attorney document, that my signature on these papers had been forged, and that I was perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. The silence in that room was deafening. Lily's face went white as paper. Evan looked like he'd been struck by lightning, and Mr. Stevens began shuffling through his papers with the desperate efficiency of a man realizing he'd been duped. But I wasn't finished. I told them about the notebook I'd found, about the months of surveillance and planning, about the fake business trips and manufactured scenarios. I told them I knew exactly what they'd been trying to do and that I had evidence of their fraud. That's when the masks finally came off and I saw my granddaughter and her husband for who they really were. Lily's sweet, concerned expression dissolved into something cold and calculating. She said I was obviously having one of my confused episodes, that my paranoid delusions were exactly why these legal protections were necessary. She turned to Mr. Stevens and suggested they proceed with the documents regardless of my objections since my mental state was clearly compromised. But Evan surprised me. Instead of supporting Lily's lies, he stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the yard where he'd helped me with my garden work. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He said he couldn't do it anymore, couldn't keep pretending that what they'd done to me was justified. He said I'd never been confused or disoriented, that I'd been kind and trusting and deserving of better than what they'd planned for me. That admission hung in the air like a confession, and suddenly Mr. Stevens was gathering up his papers and making excuses about needing to verify some information before proceeding. Within minutes he was gone, leaving the three of us alone with the wreckage of their scheme. Lily turned on Evan with a fury that revealed exactly who she really was underneath all that fake sweetness. She accused him of ruining everything, of being too weak to follow through with their plan. She said they'd invested too much time and effort to quit now, that they'd find another way to get what they deserved, as if my life's work, my home, my independence were somehow owed to them for the inconvenience of having to take care of an aging relative. That's when I realized that as devastating as this betrayal was, I was also free. Free from the guilt of my secret affair with Evan. Free from the confusion and self-doubt they'd been deliberately cultivating. Free from the fear of being alone and helpless. I was 79 years old. I'd been lied to and manipulated and nearly robbed of everything I owned. But I was still standing, still sharp enough to see through their deception, still strong enough to fight back when it mattered. The trap they'd set for me had failed. But now I had to decide what to do with the two people who'd tried to spring it. The silence that followed Lily's outbursts stretched between us, like a chasm that could never be crossed again. Evan stood by the window with his shoulders slumped like a man carrying the weight of his own shame, while my granddaughter paced the living room like a caged animal, her careful mask completely abandoned. Now that their scheme had crumbled, what happened next surprised even me. Instead of anger, I found myself feeling a deep bone-tied sadness for all of us, for what we'd lost, for what had never really been there in the first place, for the family bonds that had been twisted into weapons against the very person they were supposed to protect. That's when Lily made one final attempt to salvage their plan, and in doing so, revealed the most devastating truth of all. She sat down across from me, her face softening into something that almost resembled the granddaughter I'd raised after her parents died when she was 12. She told me she was sorry I'd found out this way, that they'd only wanted to protect me from nursing homes and medical bills that would eat up everything I'd worked for. But then she shattered whatever small hope I might have held for redemption. She said they'd been planning this since the day they moved in with me. Not just the legal documents, but everything. Every kindness Evan had shown me, every moment of intimacy we'd shared, every whispered word that had made me feel beautiful and desired again, all of it had been choreographed from the very beginning. The business trips hadn't been real. Lily worked from home. Always had. Those weeks when I thought she was away building her career were carefully planned absences designed to give Evan time to work on me, to break down my defenses and make me dependent on his attention. They'd researched my loneliness, my isolation, my need for human connection after 15 years of widowhood. The medicinal cream, the tender massages that had awakened feelings I thought were dead. None of it had been real. But the most crushing revelation came when Lily explained why they'd needed my cooperation so desperately. They were in debt, serious debt. Evan had been gambling online, had gotten in deep with people who didn't accept excuses or payment plans. They needed money fast, needed access to my accounts and the equity in my house, or they were going to lose everything, including their lives. So my lonely heart hadn't just been a vulnerability to exploit. It had been seen as the solution to problems that had nothing to do with me. In that moment, I understood something about myself that I'd never recognized before. I'd spent my whole life taking care of other people, defining my worth through my usefulness to others. Even at 79, I'd been so grateful for Evan's attention that I'd ignored every warning sign. But I was more than just someone's caregiver. Was Thessaly Brown, a woman with her own value that had nothing to do with what I could provide for other people. That realization gave me the strength to do what I did next. I told them both to pack their things and leave my house. Not tomorrow, not next week, but immediately. I said I'd be calling Harold Morrison first thing Monday morning to make sure all my legal documents were properly secured, and that if I ever saw either of them on my property again, I'd call the sheriff. Lily tried one more time to convince me I was making a mistake that I'd never be able to manage on my own. She painted pictures of me falling and lying, helpless for days, of dying alone and undiscovered. But those fear tactics that might have worked on the woman I'd been 6 months ago had no power over the woman I'd become. I'd survived their deception, had been strong enough to see through their lies and protect myself when it mattered most. Evan never said another word. He just went upstairs and started packing. When he came back down with their suitcases, he paused at the front door and looked back at me one last time. For just a moment, I thought I saw genuine regret in his eyes. But then the door closed behind them. And I was alone, truly alone, for the first time in years. And instead of being terrified, I felt something I hadn't experienced in longer than I could remember. Felt free. 3 weeks later, I got a letter from Lily. No return address. Postmarked from somewhere in California. She said they were starting over. That she hoped I'd understand someday that everything they'd done had come from a place of love, twisted though it might have been. I read that letter twice, then put it in the fireplace and watched it burn. Some betrayals are too deep for forgiveness. Some trust too broken to repair. But that doesn't mean the person who was betrayed has to carry the weight of that brokenness forever. Sometimes the greatest act of self-love is simply letting go. I still live in this house. Still tend my garden and make preserves from the pear tree out back. I've made new friends at the senior center in people my own age who understand that growing old doesn't mean becoming invisible or irrelevant. If my story has taught me anything, it's that it's never too late to discover who you really are underneath all the roles you've played. For other people, never too late to choose dignity over desperation, truth over comfortable lies. I'm 79 years old, and I'm still learning, still growing, still becoming the woman I was meant to be before the world told me I was too old to matter. And if you're listening to this story from wherever you are in your own journey, I want you to know that you matter too. Your worth isn't determined by how useful you are to other people, how much they need you, or how willing you are to sacrifice yourself for their comfort. You deserve honesty. You deserve respect. Deserve to be valued for who you are, not what you can provide. I'm still here in Hollow Ridge, still watching the seasons change from this old front porch. Still believing that every day above ground is a gift worth treasuring. If my words have moved you, if they've helped you see something in your own life that needs seeing, then maybe you could share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because every voice matters. Every story has power. Together we can help each other remember our worth. Now tell me, what city are you listening from? I'd love to know how far these old words of mine have traveled. And if you want to hear more stories from folks like me, folks who've lived long enough to learn a thing or two about survival and dignity, well, you know how to find me. I'll be right here, rocking on this porch, ready to share whatever wisdom these old bones have gathered. As long as there are ears willing to listen and hearts brave enough to hear the truth. The story continues in the next chapter in the next linked video. But first, I need you to subscribe to join the family, as we are looking forward to hit our first 10,000 subscribers target, and feel free to share your story in the comments. You matter, your voice does too.